I'm Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an institute that's part of the Milano Graduate School here at the New School. And we do applied policy research on public education, child welfare, child and family services, and we primarily look at the impact of policy on real people on the ground in their communities, including immigrant communities. We also have 2 media projects at the center. One of them is InsideSchools.org, which I hope many of you know, and if you don't know it, check it out. The other is Feet in Two Worlds, which has brought many of you here today. So Feet in Two Worlds is a radio project that's been going now for more than 6 years. It brings the work of immigrant and ethnic journalists to public radio and to our website, and we also work with journalists to build up the online content of their own newspapers, websites. And Feet in Two Worlds also organizes great dialogues like this one today. We've seen a number of articles over the last several years about immigrant families turned upside down when a parent or a grandparent or a young adult is arrested on minor charges and then ends up in long-term detention, essentially awaiting deportation or just a long detention. In New York and many other cities, the majority of undocumented people are in fact part of a mixed family that includes both documented and undocumented members, and sometimes citizens and undocumented members in the same family. So there's nothing neat and clean about this when somebody is removed and detained. We come across it in all of our other work as part of the sort of fabric of city life. Even when we're writing about public education, these kinds of things turn out to be in the lives of the kids we're writing about. So detention comes with massive emotional and economic damage to our fellow New Yorkers. So that's the inspiration behind doing this event. We invited representatives from the Federal Department of Homeland Security and CIS to take part this evening, but they all said they couldn't make it. And we also invited congressional staffers and others who could speak to the federal policy issues from the perspective of the administration and from the perspective of individual congresspeople and of the Republican leadership, but that didn't work either. So nonetheless, our goal this evening is to have a constructive discussion that engages people from different perspectives, even if those perspectives aren't as diverse as we had originally tried. So this is a chance to try to understand points of view and understand what's happening out in the city and in the region and across the country to our neighbors. I want to thank the funders that made this evening's event possible and that have been providing much needed support for Feet in Two Worlds for a while now. They include the New York Community Trust, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Ogden Foundation, the Milano Foundation, and the Cyrus Fund. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors tonight. Alexandra Delano is Professor of Global Studies at the New School for Social Research, which is a sister division of our division at the New School. She and her student, Camilo Godoy, helped to organize this event and put a lot of time and energy into it. I also want to thank Jackie Wayans and Anna Schneider and Talib Hudson and the rest of the staff of the center who did so much work to pull this together. The program this evening will start with a short talk from our guest, Maria Hinojosa, to help frame up the discussion. And then John Rudolph, who's the executive producer of Feet in Two Worlds, will come up here and moderate the conversation with the panel. And there will be time at that point, at some point during the evening, for you to chime in. We're very fortunate to have Maria here with us this evening. She's a longtime anchor and managing editor of the weekly NPR show Latino USA, and she's the president and CEO of her own production company, Futuro Media Group. Some of you may know her from her stint on CNN as a producer a few years back, which I note only because she stood out there as a truly impressive and hard-boiled reporter doing work on issues that generally does not or do not reach 24-hour cable news. In fact, they haven't reached 24-hour cable news since Maria left, as far as I'm concerned. We're going to start things off with a short segment from Maria Hinojosa's Frontline documentary, Lost in Detention, which aired recently on PBS.
These are the front lines of a new immigration crackdown in America. Federal officers from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, on their way to arrest some of the millions of immigrants who are in the country illegally.
First target, guys, he's got conviction of hit and run. Also, he's got DUIs. He's a final order. He goes to work between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. Any questions? We good?
These so-called fugitive operations are part of an immigration enforcement offensive
Pretty sure the guy's gonna be here.
that has reached historic levels under the Obama administration.
The team has been doing surveillance on this house for the last few days.
Target's up right here on my right side. Target's up.
This year, about 400,000 undocumented immigrants will be detained and deported, totaling more than 1 million since Obama took office.
We have a job to do. We enforce immigration law and we seek to remove people that are here illegally from the country in terms of protecting the public and also in terms of border security. We're setting records.
That's a hard act to follow because you're just like, what's going to happen next? And then it's like, it's gone. And you're just like, what? I need to see some more. Sorry. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm really pleased to see so many New Yorkers out who want to know about this issue. Thank you to John for having me and for everyone who's involved in this event. I just keep on thinking about this term, invisibility, the fact that people, these are really, I guess that's why it means so much to me to see so many of you here, because this is New York City. I mean, essentially, this is a story that people's lives are being impacted by, who are our neighbors. They're the people who we ride the subways with. They are here. They are part of who we are. And so, you might even expect this room to be packed, frankly, because there is so much of this happening. And the truth is that there are a lot of people who don't know about what's going on. They don't know, and it's not that they, some don't want to know, and then there are many people who simply don't know. And the truth is that telling this story in the media is really hard. It's really hard. So when I see those images, and I'm back in that moment, and part of what I wish I could do more of is to include all of you in kind of the behind the scenes, because when we met up with those ICE officers, it was Los Angeles. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 maybe. So we were waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, meeting in a parking lot outside of a McDonald's. And, it's not often that you do ride-alongs these days. There are a lot of restrictions for journalists on ride-alongs. So, and you're going out, you're going to see things, something. So there's an element of, everybody's kind of like on the edge of their seats. One of the things that struck me was that all of those agents who are ICE agents, Immigration Customs Enforcement, they were all wearing outfits that said police everywhere, on their hats, on their jackets. And I kept on saying, none all of that got cut out because you can't have everything. I mean, we have over 60, 70 hours of tape. This is an hour. So I just kept asking them, like, why are you wearing outfits that say police? You're not the police, are you? No. But we're wearing them. For me, one of the basic stories that is untold is the story of due process, or lack thereof. And in this documentary, we touched on that in a very small way because we had so much to cover. The fact that due process is not being delivered on a daily basis in our country to fellow human beings should be of concern to all of us, not just to immigrants. It should be a concern to all of us. When we went out with ICE, they knocked on the door very nicely at 6 o'clock in the morning. Oh, I'm sorry. The scary part of the story is that when we were in the car driving, they were all just like, well, you know, be careful. Stuff can happen. These are bad people. Dangerous things. Stay back. Don't get too close. You know, and so, you know, you're just like, what? You know, yeah, man, you know. You never know what can happen. You saw the guy who they were detaining? I mean, he was like 65 years old. Okay. The other man, if you go further into the documentary, was handcuffed in the shadow of La Virgen de Guadalupe, also 60 years old, a gardener. These are the people who we are in fact deporting, okay? As much as the Obama administration wants to say it's not, in fact it is. And it's happening every day, every single day. So part of that imagery, again, is just that these are bad people, they are doing bad things, and therefore they must be deported. And part of what we uncovered as we saw this is that that's not the case. There is what's being said, and then there's what's happening. Okay, the overview of the policy and political context in which the immigration detention system exists. Well, the political context is that no one wants to touch this. No one wants to touch it, and it's like we're living in an era where people just put their head in the sand, and somehow that's policy. The policy, therefore, has no real sense. There has been no real understanding of what is happening here. The Department of Homeland Security actually does not do corrections, okay? That's the Bureau of Prisons. Under the Department of Homeland Security, you have ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. They are now in charge of corrections because they're overseeing the detention centers. But the problem is that actually when you detain people, under any circumstance, you actually have to have people who understand. And I'm just talking about, let's just look at detention and what proper detention is. Setting aside that conversation from the immigration conversation for a second. Detention. The fastest growing population in detention are immigrants. Civil detention. We have the largest civilly detained population in the world. Civil detention is not criminal corrections. Two very different things. And yet, these people are now being detained and housed and overseen by Immigration and Customs Enforcement that has no real experience with detention and correction. So, on the other hand, over here in the immigration conversation, we were leaving the house yesterday. I live in West Harlem. And my daughter and I saw a man being arrested in front of our house. I don't know if he was African American, if he was an African immigrant. There are lots of African immigrants. I assumed he was an African immigrant. He had, his car had been parked. I just thought, you know, they're arresting him because he's driving without a license. He didn't just, you know, run somebody down. This is not a traffic stop. And I said to my kids, I said, I don't know what's going to happen with him, but he may end up being now put on a process of deportation. And my kids are like, oh, Mom, not again, because of course they hear this all the time, so I have to kind of moderate. And I was like, here's what you need to know, my daughter or my son. Now, whenever you are detained for any reason, this question is going to be asked to you. Where were you born? Where were you born? What difference does it make? This is the kind of basic stuff that, again, is transforming our society that we're all living, that we don't even know about, these basic issues of due process. When that happens, it isn't just affecting those immigrant families, which it is ripping them apart in the most horrific way. But other things are happening. So Once you answer that you were born in a different country, in the moment when you're arrested because of secure communities, which is the other part of the policy. I mean, the problem is that, you know, how can you sum up in 10 minutes, which I'm supposed to speak to you for, you know, a policy that is incredibly complex, second only to the tax system? It's not funny, I know. But the problem is like, we all know, like our greatest fear is getting that letter from the IRS, right? And worse, that the IRS has made a mistake. Mistakes are made, okay? And we're talking about human lives. So, a little bit of the backstory of how we ended up doing this documentary. And the truth is that reporting on immigration, again, is not something that the mainstream media wants to do. I'm not sure why. I think that a lot of people, a lot of news executives just kind of feel like we've told this story before. Kind of we've heard it. It's not resolving. It brings us headaches. People complain on every side. And I think that it's part of the problem is that they don't understand that the people who are watching and consuming the mainstream media are actually tied in some way or another to immigrants. In terms of Latinos, 1 in 4 Latinos know somebody who has been detained or deported. 1 in 4. So it is, in fact, an American story, but that hasn't really reached the level of mainstream media. So that's why other independent institutions, Feet into World, Latino USA, Futuro Media Group, why we exist to try to push the conversation. It took us a year to do this documentary. We got access because the Department of Homeland Security understood it was Frontline, and therefore we were not going to go away. But it wasn't, you know, they worked with us, but it wasn't like the doors were opening, flying open. I really feel like a lot of you are kind of like, you're making history just by being here. Let me try not to lose it. Because when you really know what's going on, it's horrific. It is. And you're just like, what? How is this happening? You know, when you're in the middle of shooting it, you can't just, you know, you're in the middle of shooting it. And believe me, I'm not coming home and talking about this stuff with my husband and my kids. But the 2 people in Willacy, in the Willacy Detention Center, and then I'll stop and we'll open up the conversation. In all of the other detention centers, I was speaking to as many people as I could. Every single person who was in detention that I could, I was speaking to. One of the first questions I was asking them was, at any point in your process of detention, were you asked if you had an American citizen child or family member? Except for one person. Everyone said no, they had never even been asked that question. So that's a problem. By the time we got to Willacy, the Department of Homeland Security sat us down into a room. Willacy is a huge detention facility that's privately run, that's basically housed in tents, like circus tents. So not really supposed to be for more than 1 or 2 days or 3 days of detention, and people are being housed there for months. And by the time we got to Willacy, our last visit, they basically they sat us down and they just said, you can't speak to anyone. You are not allowed to speak to anyone. And if you do, this tour will be ended immediately and you'll be escorted off the premises. Freedom of the press. That's what it looked like. I pushed back. I said, well, you've got to give us someone to speak to. So they chose 2 people. They chose 2 people for us to speak to at the very end. We had literally 5 minutes with them. These are the people who they had pre-screened and okayed for us to speak to. One of them was a woman from Guatemala, first-time crosser with 3 children, who got caught crossing the border and had been held for 10 days. And I asked her, has anyone explained to you why you are being held, what the process is, what is going on? when you might be released, has anyone? No. Have you been fed enough? No. Have you been able to go outdoors? No. And the second one was a man from Mexico who had been there 3 days, and the same, all no questions, all no answers to those questions. The title is appropriate. There are people, human beings, who are in fact lost in detention. They are invisible, and because they were not born in this country, they do not have access to a lawyer. And the residual impacts of what that's doing to all of us, yes, is unseen, and in a very sad way it's unseen, because they are American stories. What we need you to do is to amplify these stories. But I feel like, way back when I was a college student, several decades ago, people were gathering and hearing testimony about human rights violations that were happening in countries that people hadn't heard about, like El Salvador or Guatemala or Nicaragua, and people were gathering. And then you knew what happened. You know what happened when Central America became a huge central focal point of our international policy, had an impact with, immigration here. All of you are part of those little seeds that are here hearing these stories, and that hopefully in your civic duty will simply speak about them and share them and shed light and engage people with whom you do not agree, but with whom you can have a conversation. And perhaps that conversation has to do with due process, and probably should do a little bit with money, because the amount of money that taxpayer dollars are going into fuel this entire system of detention is massive. And again, yet another untold story. So thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this event.
Thank you, Maria. And I'd like to invite the other panelists to take their seats on the podium. Good evening. I'm John Rudolph, executive producer of Feet in Two Worlds, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here tonight. And I just want to commend you, Maria, for a really courageous piece of journalism, the documentary Lost in Detention. And if you haven't seen it in its entire length, I suggest it's available online on the PBS FRONTLINE website. Before we get into the discussion, I just want to say we've had a series of these forums sponsored by Feet in Two Worlds, and they're always kind of emotional moments, and this one is especially emotional for me because sitting up here are two journalists, Maria, who has a show, Latino USA, which is one of our media partners at Feet in Two Worlds, and Valeria Fernandez, who's based in Phoenix and flew here early this morning to be on this panel. And Valeria came to Feet in Two Worlds, and we trained her to be a radio producer, and her very first radio story on public radio was on Latino USA. Valeria is now reporting for CNN Español, CNN International, Radio Bilingüe, and so this is really what Feet in Two Worlds is all about. So I'm really just thrilled to see you two sitting side by side. I also want to mention that this panel discussion, this event tonight, is the first time that Feet in Two Worlds has partnered with other institutions in the new school. Although we've been here for a while, we've really matured and become more integrated into the new school, and I want to just acknowledge the Global Studies Program, the Global Migration Group, the International Center for Migration, Ethnicity, and Citizenship, and especially Alexandra Delano, who has made this possible, and I want to thank you. Appropriate. So I have already introduced Valeria, and I'd like to, and Maria you've already heard from, and our other two panelists who we are thrilled to have with us tonight are Jackie Vimo. She's the Director of Advocacy at the New York Immigration Coalition, and Jackie's been working for over 15 years in the field of public policy on a broad array of issues, including HIV/AIDS, public health, public assistance, LGBTQ issues, housing, workers' rights, racial justice, and immigration. And she's currently a PhD candidate writing a doctoral dissertation about immigration detention and prisoners at the New School right here. Welcome, Jackie. And Amy Gottlieb is the program director of the American Friends Service Committee, Immigrant Rights Program in Newark. That's a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the rights of immigrants and refugees through legal services, community organizing, and advocacy. And Amy is currently also working as a visiting assistant clinical professor in the Cardozo Immigration Justice Clinic. Welcome to you all. Want to also just mention that we are online tonight. This event is being live streamed on Ustream. Thank you. You can say that. And we are also tweeting it on Twitter at #DetentionForum. So if you have your devices with you and you want to follow our Twitter stream or add to it, we invite you to visit #DetentionForum. As Maria pointed out, immigrants are the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population in this country. It's estimated that nearly 400,000 immigrants are detained each year, and more than 31,000 are in detention at any one time. The majority are held in state and local facilities, such as county jails. Significant numbers are also held in federal facilities and privately owned facilities under contract with government agencies. I'd like to start out by understanding a little bit more of the legal context in which this detention system exists. This morning, Valeria was on the Brian Lehrer Show, and one of the questions that was asked is, who are the detainees and how do they end up in the system? And maybe, Valeria, you could do a repeat performance now.
Well, you can never repeat it quite the same, but I guess I would like to share with you how I hear about this on an everyday basis through phone calls and through my job as a journalist. Somebody's brother or sister or mother was stopped on their way to work, on the way to the grocery store for some minor violation. Maybe they didn't put the turn signal, and police officer asked them for documentation. Where are your papers? They don't have them, and that's how they end up in the county jail. Now, a number of the county jails across the country, not just in Arizona, have programs such as Secure Community and 287G that allow them to basically identify people that are here without documents and place a hold on them to turn them over eventually to immigration authorities. And that's how they end up in the detention system. There's another way that I didn't mention on the radio that Maria addresses in her documentary, which is also people that Immigration and Customs Enforcement actually actively goes looking for them through these fugitive teams. And these are people that have maybe an immigration judge decided they needed to be removed from the country, and there was a deportation order that they ignored or that they didn't receive because they moved. And there's also, of course, well, there's a variety. It's pretty broad. But one of the most common ways in which I'm seeing this in Arizona is through these traffic stops, and it's through the increased network of local police that are cooperating with the federal government with all these programs, and sometimes outside the scope of these programs, the way that we've seen with Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who is doing raids in different immigrant communities. It's sometimes it's mind-blowing because people end up there literally because they don't have a driver's license, and sometimes they present a driver's license from their country or an ID from Mexico or Guatemala, and the police doesn't believe that that's a legit document, and then they arrest them, bring them in jail, and book them for fraud or possession of a fraudulent document. And that, at the end of the day, is never proved because the person doesn't want to stay in the jail. They want to be released to the immigration authorities as fast as possible so they can get back with their family and get it over with. So they really never get their day in court to have a due process and actually say, listen, I'm innocent, and the reason why you stopped me or the charges that you brought against me, they're really not legit.
Amy Gottlieb,
Won't answer.
maybe you could follow up on that and talk a little bit more about the rights that detainees have once they have entered this vast network of detention facilities.
Sure. And also just to add two pieces to what Valeria was saying, because I think it's really important to get the big picture context. We also detain arriving asylum seekers, so anybody who arrives at a port of entry in the United States and says that they're afraid to return to their home country because they might be persecuted or killed, they are subject to detention. And the other category of people that's extremely large in detention are people who are lawful permanent residents, green card holders, who are facing deportation because of a criminal record. And that's a very big piece of this puzzle that I think is one that we need to really kind of unpack and challenge ourselves on how we even think about and talk about it.
So let me just stop you there and just picture someone who has finally made it to the U.S. because they're seeking asylum, and they're greeted by being detained.
That's right. Yes, they're greeted by being detained. The Elizabeth Detention Center in New Jersey, which is run by Corrections Corporation of America, was opened after having been closed after riots in 1995. It was reopened in January of 1997, specifically to house asylum seekers. It's a 300-bed facility. Over the years, and particularly since September 11th, the number of asylum seekers coming in has gone down. So we do see fewer, but we see, I'd say probably like 10 or 15 new asylum seekers detained in New Jersey alone every month, that we're seeing in the detention centers.
I think it's important to talk just for a second about the green card holders, because because when you say that they're being held because of a criminal background, and you may think, well, if they just held up a store last week, well, maybe possibly they should. In fact, these are people who, let's say, in the case of our documentary, somebody who I met who lived in the Bronx, who was then being held in Willacy for 2 years, who's Jamaican. When he came here 25 years ago at 18, he was caught selling whatever, coke or weed or whatever, and he was processed and charged and served a sentence of whatever, 18 months. So he served his time. This is what you call double jeopardy.
Exactly.
Because now they arrive at his home in a fugitive ops operation, and they say, sorry, yeah, you did your time, but it doesn't matter. Now you're going to be deported. And he ends up spending 2 years because he chooses to fight his deportation. And so he's held in those tents for 2 years, and that's where the abuse that he endures that we weren't even able to get into. But in those detention centers, you're exactly right. It is people with green cards, with children. So my big thing now is that whenever I meet anyone, I'm sorry, but it's true, and I just say, do you have a green card? Yes, I'm so happy I have my green card. I'm like, I'm sorry. Doesn't really do much for you.
That's true.
It means that right now, at this moment, if you're stopped and you're asked, you have something to show. Beyond that,
So do you want me to get back to your
Yes,
question on
if you
rights?
would, yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
great,
so in general, and it's different depending on the different factors, right? So arriving asylum seekers are one set of facts in terms of the law, and people with green cards are another. In general, a person who is arrested and placed into deportation proceedings, which means you go before an immigration judge, and the immigration court system is within the Department of Justice. It's a two-level court system. There's the trial level immigration courts, and then there's the Board of Immigration Appeals where you can appeal. You are entitled to due process of law, right? And that's a very broad term, and Maria, I'm really happy that you mentioned it. Due process is interpreted in many different ways, but basically in the immigration context, it sort of meant that, well, you get to go before an immigration judge, and you get an interpreter if you don't speak English, and you have a right to an attorney if you can pay for one, or if you are one of the very lucky people who can be represented by one of the very few, unfortunately, nonprofit legal services organizations. So American Friends Service Committee is one of those organizations. Human Rights First is another, Catholic Charities. But in New Jersey, there are about 6 organizations that provide free legal services to immigrants in detention, and all of us are basically strapped for resources. It's very, very hard to get resources to pay attorneys. And we have over 1,000 people detained.
And
So-
what percentage of the detainees, the entire detainee population, goes without representation?
80% of the entire detainee population throughout the country goes without representation. And as Maria said, the immigration law is, people joke about it, but it is as complex or, a little even more complex than the tax system. So people are going before immigration judges without the benefit of counsel. And just one more thing I'll say on rights, and that is that the idea of going before an immigration judge seems like a good thing. But in 1996, President Clinton signed an immigration law into effect that made it virtually impossible for immigration judges to actually consider the human being that's before them. So if it's a green card holder with a criminal conviction, for example, and if it's a certain type of criminal conviction, and it's a huge list of criminal convictions, the judge can only see that conviction. The judge cannot look at, for example, how long a person's been here, what their family ties are, what their level of rehabilitation is, what they've done in their community. So people who, I have a friend who came here at 7 years old and got caught up in bad things when he was, kind of early 20s and spent time in jail for a robbery. And he's now 42, I think, and he was deported to Guyana over last summer. There was not one family member left in Guyana. He had not been to Guyana since he was 7 years old. He grew up in Brooklyn. He grew up in Crown Heights. He was taking care of his blind diabetic mother. He was the sole caretaker of his mother. He's also kind of a surrogate father to his young nephew. He's in Guyana, and he is permanently exiled from the United States. He can never come back. So he couldn't go before the immigration judge and say, I've been rehabilitated, my life is better, look, I've changed. And it's also, it creates this disincentive for people who do have criminal convictions to, try to get their lives back together, because the ultimate consequence is going to be deportation.
Can I just say also, in terms of, you have an image of, well, they're going to see a judge. You have an image of what that looks like. You're going to go and you're actually going to see a judge, and you're going to be able to maybe, in some cases, at least see the judge. At Willacy, and they didn't let us shoot this, you don't see a judge. You actually see a video camera. It's closed circuit.
I'd like to bring Jackie Vimo into the conversation. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and we've touched on a bunch of things. But before we move on to the situation facing families and particularly vulnerable populations in the immigrant community, Jackie, so you're in detention, and as Amy said, about 80% don't have legal counsel. What resources, if any, do you have at your disposal to figure out your situation?
Well, I mean, in some ways, actually, Amy's a better person to answer that question, because she's sort of more doing the direct legal representation. But, I mean, can I just actually pull it back for 1 second and just talk about the history of immigration detention in the U.S. more broadly, which is, this is a really new phenomenon. Detention, as we know it, really just emerged in the last few decades. And I think that, we didn't even really have, an immigration agency in this country until 1891. And we really, when people think about Ellis Island, they think about this welcoming place. Well, it also was a detention center. But Ellis Island never functioned like a detention center at the scope that the detention centers today function. At the most, usually people spent 10 hours in Ellis Island. Some people say maybe as much as 2 weeks. People in the detention centers in the United States spend sometimes years at a time in immigration detention. And this didn't really happen until the second half of the 20th century, when basically, detention and the immigration situation we have is a problem of our own making, because the reason that the main driving force of people coming into this country was refugees leaving Central America from largely fleeing political and economic situations that were aided by U.S. military support. So, so we start to have this problem in the 80s, and it's not really till 1996 where we get this new mandatory detention regime that we really start to see this number. So just to give a sense of people, the scope of this, we're talking about in the last 15 years, the system has quadrupled, right? So we go from like barely in the mid 20th century, a negligible amount of people in detention, almost nothing, to all of a sudden 400,000, and most of that growth in the last 15 years. So I just want to sort of we haven't had detention forever. It's a new thing. It's something that's happened, under President Reagan and under Clinton and Obama, and especially under President Obama. So I just want to sort of say that it hasn't been here forever. Do you want to answer the sort of specific resources? Because this is what American Friends Services Committee does. So
sure.
Yeah.
When you're not represented, it's like I said, it's really hard. I teach immigration law, and I use this big fat 900-page textbook, or more than that actually. And the first sentence in the textbook is the Immigration and Nationality Act is a hideous creature. And that's what unrepresented people are facing when they go before an immigration judge to try to figure out, for example, maybe I'm not subject to mandatory detention. How do I fight that? Is there any way I can stay here? Is there any mistake in my papers? Maybe I'm really a U.S. citizen. Is there anything? What's the difference between being inadmissible and deportable? Right? I mean, very complex issues that are really hard to work out. So there's a program actually funded by the Department of Justice that through the immigration court system, it's called the Legal Orientation Program, and that funds organizations to actually go in and provide Know Your Rights presentation. So it sounds like the people at Willisey were missed or weren't. You have to kind of be there when the folks who do the presentations come in, and you might, the timing might not work. These organizations also are really strapped, and they are limited on what they can do. They can go tell people, what their rights are, what the process is going to be like. They can do individual interviews with people to try to help them get attorneys, but they're not allowed to use the funding that they get from the Department of Justice to actually do direct representation. So they can't take on the cases of the people that they meet in the presentation. So we have also a project doing Know Your Rights presentations at some of the facilities in New Jersey. And again, we desperately try to get counsel for people, but the numbers are virtually none of people who are willing to take pro bono immigration cases. We're working to get access to legal resources for detainees. We're just working at Detainee Hall, which is the new facility in New Jersey. They've just agreed to allow the detainees to have access to Lexis. But using Lexis is not easy. So if you have no legal background, you try to work your way around I think they're using CDs. They're not even using the online version. That's really complicated. There are visitation programs I want to acknowledge also that make an enormous difference for people, and we can talk about those later and how you can get involved. But those are actually some of the ways that people have access to the outside world, because oftentimes people's family members can't visit because they themselves don't have papers. Mm-hmm. So that is another whole angle of this that, I think makes a huge difference. The visitors, and there's some in this room, make an absolutely enormous difference in the lives of people who are detained.
I just want to add one tiny thing, and I know I'd say it cautiously, but there's also a lot of abuse going on the part of the attorneys that do charge. Yes. You see it all the time. Families, extended families, really struggle to raise the money to pay these attorneys. They promise incredible things, and they disappear. They never fulfill. I literally had that happen to a friend of mine. By the time he ended up in the detention center, his family called the office, and they say the attorney was on vacation after he paid about $3,000, and that was it. And so family after family after family goes through that type of situation. And really, if you don't have information, it's so complicated to understand the way it works. It's like you believe your attorney. I mean, he's the person that's supposed to advise you, and it's really, really easy to fool you because you want to believe that there is hope after, so many people tell you there's nothing can be done in your case.
And another just a quick complication is also they don't necessarily detain you where you live or where you're arrested.
Right.
So you may be arrested in New York and you end up in Arizona. So maybe you had a friend who was an attorney who could come help you, you know, locally.
Yeah.
But you know, or you know, in terms of people being able to visit you, you know, I know I also teach at City College, and I had so many students who would have parents detained. And you know, the cost of the family, you know, even if it was actually something as close as Pennsylvania, you know, they didn't have cars, they didn't have driver's licenses, and having to say, I can't see my father because I can't afford the bus ticket to go see my dad, you know, because he was detained miles and miles away from where he was arrested and where his family lives. And it's a huge hardship on the family. So that's another huge
and these are the family values. I mean, these are the family values that right now are being seen in our country. So the young man who we interview, who is from a small town outside of Chicago, and you know, he's as American as they come, of course, parece mexicano, but he's an American kid from the heartland of Illinois. And you know, when I asked him, so what did you know, what do you want to be? What did you want to be? He was like, well, I don't have any time to think about that now. I wanted to be a lawyer. But he's like, it doesn't seem like this country really wants me to be one. So,
Commercial.
you know, it's that notion that then, you know, what does this country really stand for, really at its core? And then I do think that we come back to full circle to what is happening with this administration. Why? Why is this happening? Why is it that under President Obama, you have the largest number of people who have been deported in the history of the United States? And of course they will say, well, you know, the president cannot make laws. True. Where has the inactivity been in terms of moving Congress? Why? Or, on the other hand, what can the president do, in fact? If you think back to what happened during, after the Cuban Revolution, and all of the young people who were brought out of Cuba, the Peter Pan, they're known as Peter Pan, they were sent out of Cuba. They also, too, were undocumented. And it was because of President Kennedy, who created an executive order that then they were able to stay. So that there is precedent. The president could, in fact, say, under my watch, you will no longer deport anyone under 18, or you will no longer deport a parent of an American citizen child. He could. He's choosing not to. And just to wrap it up, you know, you are hearing a lot about what the administration says it is doing to make the situation better in this election year. And the question, and of course you know this, which is, where is the protocol? We love the fact that you have had a news conference and you've released a press release and you've put it on your website and it says, we're going to do this. Judicial review, prosecutorial discretion. Show me the paperwork. Show me the, you know, where the judges or the lawyers, who is good. Just show me, because once you've been in, you know this. There is no one inside any of these detention centers now, because of what President Obama has done, that is standing inside the detention centers with a little sign that says, I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you with judicial review and prosecutorial discretion.
I think we're going to hopefully get back to some of these broader political and policy questions in the question and answer period. I'm sure people are going to be focused on that, among other issues. But I wanted to go back to the image of that big old textbook that Amy was talking about, and mention that on ICE's website they also explain their procedures, and we had invited ICE to participate in this forum, and I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that we repeatedly reached out to them and they declined to participate. The picture that I'm sure is emerging for you at this point is a group of people that are in a very vulnerable position when they're in detention. And even within that population, there are those who are especially vulnerable. And these include women who are subject to sexual abuse, parents of children living in the U.S., especially mothers, Black and Hispanic detainees who are subject to racial profiling, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender immigrants subject to sexual abuse and discrimination. What we're going to do now is show you another short clip from Maria's documentary, Lost in Detention, where we hear from a woman who was sexually abused in detention in the Willacy facility.
Without access to attorneys, critics say detainees are vulnerable in other ways. They're less likely to have legal protection in cases of physical and sexual abuse. During her 3 months at Willacy, Mary says she endured repeated sexual assaults by a guard.
He kissed me, and then I pushed him, and then he said, well, I love big-breasted women. And then he took his hands and he put it in my pants.
He put his hands in your pants.
And he said, well, do you like that? Does it feel good? Because you're locked up, so you don't know what it feels like. And I pushed him away. And I said, please let me go.
And then what happened?
He said, if you tell anyone, you wouldn't come out of here alive to see your family. So then, who are you going to?
Mary says she told a female guard about the attacks.
She said to me that if you go to ICE and you complain or you write a report, it's going to be worse for you because they don't want a bad name that these things are going on.
Don't complain about the fact that you've been sexually assaulted because it could be worse for you if you complain.
Yes.
They could retaliate against you?
Yes.
Lights? Okay, great. Jackie, how widespread are these complaints of abuse?
So, it's actually both an easy question to answer and a difficult question to answer. They're extremely widespread, but also there's a lot of underreporting. The ACLU of Texas did a Freedom of Information request, found that there were nearly 200 allegations of sexual abuse of immigrant detainees since 2007 alone. So that's not that many years. They actually then filed a class action suit on behalf of 3 women who had been sexually assaulted while in the custody of ICE. And this is really the worst part of the story, not that there's anything worse than being sexually assaulted, but these were women that were coming as asylum seekers because of histories of sexual abuse and trauma in their home countries. So to come fleeing sexual abuse and then to be put in immigration detention center to be raped is, really, this is what the system is doing. What might be shocking to many of you is actually legally, detainees are not covered under the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. They are not covered.
And that was a determination that was recently made by U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder.
Yes. It's something that the ACLU's been working on. There's a petition online if you go to the ACLU's website that you can sign on to ask that the Prison Rape Elimination Act be applied to immigrant detainees. And it's not just women that are raped. We know, of course, that men also experience sexual assault in these conditions, and also other vulnerable populations. Lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender communities also disproportionately experience these kinds of assaults. In April 2002, there was a woman, Cristina Madrazo, who was a transgender woman from Mexico petitioning for asylum on the basis of being transgendered. She was raped by a prison guard in the Chrome detention facility, and then after she reported it, she was put back under the supervision of that same guard, and it happened again. So, these situations are, you have to take into consideration what a vulnerable position people are in. There may be fleeing countries where actually being LGBTQ is actually illegal. So, they don't even have a context for the fact that there could be protections for this in terms of where they're coming from, coming to the United States, and then to be singled out from abuse in the context of immigration detention facilities. And I think so. And the other piece is, of course, a lot of lesbians and gays could be sponsored by their same-sex partners for a marriage petition, but because of the Defense of Marriage Act, it's the federal government does not recognize same-sex marriages for immigration purposes. So even if you're from New York, it doesn't matter. If you have a same-sex partner, your immigrant partner cannot be sponsored if you're a citizen for immigration purposes. So, marriage is not the answer. It's really, sort of a much larger, so Defense of Marriage Act is one piece, but then that also would leave out all the other LGBTQ community that aren't married, so there's a lot of different pieces here.
ICE recently announced the appointment of a public advocate. And I wonder, Amy, do you see this in any way as a response to the complaints, the filings of complaints against ICE for various types of abuse?
Are you going to make me show my cynical side?
Well, first of all, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the public advocate is supposed to do.
Well, the public advocate is supposed to be available to the general public to respond to complaints, such as we've been hearing. I mean, that's sort of the generic definition of what the person is supposed to do. The person who is in that position has, in fact, been in a similar position with different names within ICE for the last, 5 or 6 years, if not more. And he's been a community liaison. He's been coordinating meetings with NGOs to kind of work out some of the kinks. Most recently, before being appointed public advocate, he was in the Office of Detention Policy. I never remember the name of that office, but the office that focuses on detention policy within ICE. To be responding to some concerns about conditions in detention. So I would say that, there's been an attempt, when the Department of Homeland Security was first created in 2003, after September 11th, when INS was, the original INS was sort of disbanded and broken up into 3 different agencies within Department of Homeland Security. We as advocates and NGOs had a very hard time even getting them to answer the phone, having meetings with us. We had a history of meeting with INS when INS existed on some of the concerns about detention, et cetera. When DHS was formed, it took years for us to even get a meeting scheduled. And there's been an ongoing history of what they call liaison meetings with community groups to talk about some concerns, to try to work things out. And so it took a couple years. And I think under the Bush administration, we were able to start getting meetings. And under the Obama administration, suddenly there's all these meetings happening. There's all these working groups and access that we have to ICE where we have these meetings. But frankly, I do not think that they're accomplishing very much, except that ICE can say that it meets with community groups. And that's where my cynicism comes in about it. We keep getting these sort of promises after a detention report was issued 2 years ago by the former person in charge of immigration detention who recognized, Dora Schreiro, who's now the Commissioner of Corrections in New York City, she recognized, having been brought from the corrections world into ICE, that civil detention is something that we don't really understand, and that to have an organization running this huge prison system without any understanding of detention, that was a disaster. And she wrote a report that had some wonderful recommendations if you choose to accept the fact that civil detention is okay in the first place, which I don't. But assuming you want to accept that, then she had some very good recommendations that included improving access to attorneys and access, conditions kinds of things, and visitation and outdoor rec and food and lots of things. But virtually none of those recommendations have been implemented. And we keep getting these stories from ICE that the ICE union doesn't like to implement what headquarters is saying. So whether that's an accurate portrayal of what's happening, we're getting stories that, the officers on the ground think that they're, protecting us from danger by keeping these people locked up when we can't give them more freedom. And so we unfortunately haven't seen those improvements, so that's why I'm skeptical about the public advocate. When they issued the announcement about the public advocate a couple of weeks ago, it was a big splashy press release, but they didn't include contact information. So how could people actually send an email or phone the public advocate to share their complaint? So, we can be hopeful, and I think it's really important to use those resources that ICE is putting out there, so that we need to raise our complaints with the public advocate. We need to raise our complaints with the counties that are running the county jails where people are detained. We need to be raising our complaints with local ICE, and if we're not getting responses from local ICE, we need to be bringing them up to headquarters. And that's, frankly, a burden on the very few organizations that are trying to do this work. But it's key in, I think, trying to get some sense of accountability, because that's what's missing. And so the Public Advocate's Office might be an attempt to really create better accountability, and I would love to say, yeah, it's a great thing. And maybe this is the new incarnation, and maybe it's going to be great. But I would say test it. If you know of stories where people are not, visitors aren't allowed to get in, or attorneys aren't allowed to visit their clients without having, a clear notice of appearance in before they meet the client, which you can't really do until you meet the client. We need to be calling the public advocate and telling him, and he needs to be responding.
I want to ask a follow-up question to Maria and also to you about what is standing in the way of these investigations. What in the system is keeping the complaints from being investigated? What's going on or what's not in place? What do you find out?
You invite a bunch of journalists to the panel, and they all started asking each other tough questions.
If you are a guard and you want to sexually assault or beat up a detainee, and the detainee brings forth a complaint. I mean, the thing that we haven't talked about is the thing that we also witnessed that didn't end up, and I know you know this, which is that they'll just deport that person who has made the complaint. So what happens to the complaint there? The person has been deported. The case is closed.
And let me just stop you for a minute, Maria, because the issue is, as I understand it, the people contest their cases. They challenge their deportation because they have family in the United States and they want to stay with their family. So they're kind of in this catch-22 situation. They could agree to be deported, and then they don't have any contact with their family, or they could stay and fight with this in this kind of crazy maze-like structure that is the detention system.
Right, and then if they get sexually assaulted in the process, and they decide that they want to complain, just as the woman who we spoke to said, they would have just deported her. I mean, he said he was going to do something worse. But what I was going to say is that you have then these companies that are privately run that then come in and do audits to say if everything is okay. Most of the time, a place like Willacy, I don't know what the most recent audit, but the one we saw, had given it passing grade.
Well, I mean,
so it's kind of like it's all this big circle that, so what happens to these complaints? So the real question is what you brought up, which is the fact is that the number of people who actually step forward to complain is minuscule.
I mean, but part of the problem is also the fact that these detention centers are indeterminate places, right? So in the 80s and 90s, we saw immigration law and criminal law coming to be the same thing, right? They call it crimmigration law now. It's almost indistinguishable from one another. And that, in 2009, President Obama had said, we recognize that someone who's coming here who crosses the border to seek a better life for his or her family shouldn't be placed in a prison setting. These shouldn't be prisons. And so he said, all right, we'll do something. We'll create, and this is what Amy was referring to, and maybe not everyone in the room is familiar with it. He says, I'm going to change the system. I'm going to create a civil detention model, a kindler, gentler detention, that would have different, so that you could distinguish an immigrant detention center from a high maximum security prison where there's serial killers housed, right? Although we should talk a little bit about the fact that there are actually prisoners and people, the immigrant detainees are also frequently housed in county jails and other, mainstream prison facilities. But 2 years after, he said, that he was going to change something. So that including, create a set of policies and standards for making life better for immigrants. Well, 2 years later, nothing's happened. And actually, this is a really great book, report by Ruthie Epstein, who's right here, about what the last 2 years, this is Human Rights First, Jails and Jumpsuits, around what the so-called changes that President Obama promised really look like on the inside. So, access to recreation, being able to go outdoors and see fresh air, not having to wear, prisoners' uniforms. I mean, they said, we're not going to get rid of the uniforms entirely, but something that makes you look less, like a prisoner. Having actually contact with family members. People sometimes have to speak to their family members through video screens, even though they're just sitting feet away from each other, right? I mean, this is inhuman, right? And maybe the family travels for a really long time and only gets to speak to their family members for 30 minutes. Why? Even if we acknowledge that this person is not a risk to the community, and so so I think that the fact that this is not really a kind of a penal situation, but it's being treated in this limbo land is important. And the truth is there are alternatives. And we don't actually have to use immigration detention. Alternatives to detention, ATDs, are much cheaper than detention. There's actually great success rates of letting people use community-based organizations and other networks to ensure that they'll meet their court dates. And they have really high success rates of showing that if the purpose of detention is making sure the person doesn't go away, ATDs are much cheaper. Instead of charging, $120 a day, they can cost $12 a day, right, in the middle of budget crisis situation, and they're much more humane, and so the family can, you can be at home with your family. So, the big question is, why are we detaining people in the first place?
I want to just ask Valeria to talk a little bit about, we've been talking about ICE facilities that are either operated by ICE or under contract with ICE, but as we've noted a couple of times, a lot of people are in detention in county jails and local and state facilities. And Valeria, you've had a lot of experience with the Maricopa County system for detainees, and I wonder if the issues are similar. Are there differences? Is it better, worse, the same, would you say, than people who are in federal facilities?
Well, I mean, it's very, very important to clarify this. Sometimes the federal government contracts with the county jails to house immigrants that are facing deportation proceedings. But what happens in Maricopa County, it's a little different. It's actually the sheriff's office who is, arresting the immigrants and keeping them in jail with criminals, even though 70% of the people in that jail are accused of a crime and they haven't been sentenced yet. But they're entering in some of the most dangerous jails in the country. I mean, I don't have to tell you what Amnesty International said about these jails just a couple of years ago. The Department of Justice is still investigation of use within the jails. They found that there was, a practice of civil rights violations in there. It's very, very tough, especially for the type of people that are going in, mothers or parents that were working, to be put into this kind of system. It's very rough. I hear oftentimes, complaints about discriminations, the language that they use, the way that guards touch the women when they do the screenings, when they have visitors. And also there's this prohibition that applies also to the detention centers. Basically, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you can't enter the jail. And that really isolates the person from the family, which they need at that time. And it's horrific also for the children to have to see their parents. They meet with them in this really small room. They're shackled. They're wearing this stripy uniform. And most of them sometimes are just there, like I said before, because they didn't have a proper driver's license, because they're accused of having false documents, which sometimes is not the case. But the system, it's just so packed with cases that sometimes, even to wait to plead guilty, you're there for 3 or 4 months. And in between, I mean, your family is struggling on the outside just the same way that they are in a detention center. To pay rent, to figure out what's going to happen with the custody of your kids. I'm working on a film project that follows the story of this little girl that she's a U.S. citizen, and she finds herself in that situation with mom and dad in Arpaio's jail. And the family was even scared to go to the court hearings. You really don't know the system. They were fine to go to the court, but they were scared to be there. So they had to rely on other people in the community to help them out, other people to help them get the custody of the girl, all along in fear that the Child Protective Services of Arizona, I know everywhere it has a different name, will come and take custody of that kid because you don't have legal documents. You may not qualify, to be, maybe you can clarify that, a legal guardian of that child. I don't know if I got a little bit ahead of the...
No, actually, that's a perfect lead-in because we want to show you one more clip, and this is from Valeria's documentary, which is just having the finishing touches put on it. It's called Two Americans, and it follows Kathy Figueroa, is that right? Who witnessed her parents, who are both undocumented, arrested at the car wash where they worked in Phoenix. By sheriff's deputies under Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and the two Americans are Kathy and America's toughest sheriff, Joe Arpaio. And here's a little excerpt from the film.
Figueroa, ¿qué ha pasado con tus papás? Llegó el car wash y los agarró trabajando. Está uno trabajando honradamente y le pierde uno todo en un segundo.
What do you want today to illustrate for those watching? What's the message?
To help with other families.
Is somebody making you march today, or are you doing it on your own?
Hola, Catherine. ¿Dónde están tus papás? En la cárcel. ¿En qué cárcel? La Estrella Jail y en la Durango Jail. I was very unhappy. I just felt like going in front of him and saying, let my parents out. But we couldn't do that. A mi hija ha venido a visitarme, que ella no sabe ni por qué no me puede tocar, que yo tengo que hacerme la fuerte cuando ella viene, se va y me pongo a llorar porque pues completamente se quedó sola. Yo nunca había estado en una cárcel, ni en México, ni aquí. Estoy viviendo aquí, es muy difícil, muy traumático, muy humillante para uno.
Imagine a mom that has been working for 13 years. She goes to work, she goes home, she goes to work, she goes home. And then all of a sudden, she goes into Arpaio jail with real criminals. People that are really dangerous. Can you imagine how horrific it might be to be treated as a criminal? Being shouted at by the sheriff's employees, cussing at her, making lewd remarks at her, having to see fights.
Con más personas que están igual que uno, que nada más viene a trabajar y lo tratan a uno peor que si hubiera matado a alguien.
Can I say something else? Well, that wasn't the end for Catherine's mom in a sense that she didn't know at that point whether or not she was going to go to have to go into a detention center. And actually, immigration, due to the publicity that this case got, which we were highlighting there, so sort of how this little girl was thrown into the spotlight, something very difficult to deal with. I think something that a child wouldn't have to go through. And she was released. Immigration let her go and reunite with the family, but the father was transferred to an immigration detention center. What happened is they both plead guilty to impersonating a legal worker. I was there in the courtroom. And because of that charge, he was considered to have sort of a criminal record, because this is part of the strategy in Arizona and other places to try to slap these records on the immigrants to, damage their chances to ever immigrate, and possibly to increase the figures that show you, look, they're criminals in the statistics. So they had to pay $13,000 to get him out of jail. Now, part of the sentence on the criminal charges for work, impersonating a legal worker, was to do about 200 hours of community work for free. And that was, at the end of the day, he's back working at the car wash with legal documents for now.
I also just wanted to point out the mixed status families situation, right? We're, the New York Immigration Coalition is a statewide coalition, and we're also a border state here in New York, which is something we don't often think about, those of us who are in the city. And we there's a huge migrant farm worker population upstate, and we have heard multiple cases where they'll pick up the parent, detain them, and then leave the kid on the side of the road, and the kid might be a U.S. citizen, and so, this is the kind of thing that's happening on a regular basis here in New York. It's not just in Arizona. It's not just, in places that don't have as friendly immigration policies as we do have here
So
in New York
imagine if it's happening in New York,
Yeah.
you can just imagine the others in
So
other places.
what happens to the children of parents who are detained and deported? My understanding is there is that many of the kids go into foster care, but there's a real disconnect between the foster care system and the detention and immigration enforcement system, and I wonder if any of you can elaborate on that.
There's a wonderful report that was just issued a couple months ago by Color Lines called Shattered Families, that looks at very specifically the number of kids who've ended up in foster care because of a parent being in detention and deported. It often depends. There's, we haven't seen too much of that in New Jersey, but it happens. And, a lot sort of depends. Families can make decisions sometimes, right? Like, do they want to leave a kid behind with a relative if there's going to be an absolute deportation, or do they want to take a child with them? And, if the child is a U.S. citizen, that child can come back, whenever that child wants. The parents might not ever be able to come back, but maybe, a U.S. citizen child can sponsor a parent when they turn 21 years old. Now, if the parents have been here out of status and a whole other host of factors, it might make it very difficult, but in general, that can happen. So sometimes the children go back to the home country, which sort of defeats the whole purpose of the migration in the first place, right? Because they came here to find other opportunities for younger family members, usually. Many times children are left behind in the U.S. with family members who are documented, with aunts, uncles, neighbors, friends, et cetera. And if there are not plans in place for that, the child can end up in the foster system. So in a very sad story, one of our offices in the American Friends Service Committee in Des Moines, where there were major workplace raids in the late 90s and early 2000s, one of the things they did was they created a booklet for immigrants in the community so they could know what to do. And one of the things they were told to plan for is create a custody plan, create powers of attorney, create a custody plan for your child if you are picked up. And these are the kinds of things that activists are kind of forced to do, to have conversations with immigrant communities, because the danger of being torn away from your kids is so great. And Color Lines has recently done a campaign on behalf of one of the people who is profiled in the story, and he is, there's a court hearing coming up, right? And I feel like this was just in the paper yesterday. Court hearing coming up in North Carolina, is that where it is? Where there's a child services hearing where the father, who has been deported, is about to lose custody. The mother is a U.S. citizen. The father's about to lose custody entirely. But because of pressure, they're slowing down that process and actually postpone the hearing. So I think media pressure on that topic in particular is really going to make a huge difference. And there's also, there are special laws that protect immigrant kids in the U.S., and some of those laws are actually quite good. And, you know, there's a lot of training going on of, you know, in the New Jersey, it's the Division of Youth and Family Services. New York, it's Child Services. You know, a lot of training of those staff members in those agencies to ensure that they understand what to do, either with undocumented kids or with kids who are facing the deportation of a parent.
But there's also one situation, which is when the mother or the father is in immigration custody, there's not a connection between the other system, the family court, and so sometimes there's the hearing. Maybe you can talk just briefly about that.
Oh, you can miss a hearing, right? I mean, you're locked up in immigration detention. They're not going to take you to family court for your family court hearing, right? So you're going to be seen as abandoning your child, and nobody's going to tell the judge in family court that you're locked up in immigration detention. And the same thing happens with criminal cases. You know, if you're locked up in immigration detention and you have an open criminal warrant, that case can come and go, and nobody tells the criminal court judge that you're locked up in immigration detention. So then you get arrested, and then you get a warrant for your arrest, right? So these kinds of things happen all the time. The communication is disastrous, and if you don't have an attorney, if you have an attorney, you're better off. But even so, it doesn't always happen because a person might not even know to tell you that they have a family court hearing. They might not have gotten notice. So the systems are so separate, and people just have so little access to information. And ICE officers, you know, often will just refuse to transport people from immigration detention to another court hearing. They just refuse to do it. It's not in their contract, you know.
And as I understand it, a detained parent who is subsequently released may have their child already in the foster system, and it's often hard for them to regain custody of their child because the system has moved along in the absence of the parent.
That's right.
And in some cases, in the worst cases, children have been adopted away when they're younger, and just simply adopted away.
I wanted to mention something. What if this is the worst case scenario, and I ran into it? Your kids were with someone you really couldn't trust, and the police, when they arrested you and when they deported you and everything, and then you pleaded for them to find out where your kids are, no one did anything. I ran into a case of a woman. It took 4 months to finally get someone to pay attention and get her kids and send them back to Mexico. But I had to talk to, I couldn't believe it. There wasn't anything in place to figure out, okay, who do you go to once the mother is deported and no one knows where the children are because the babysitter took them?
And until recently, actually, if you were even looking for your family member, you couldn't find them. There was actually no one to call, you know, specifically. So your father or mother or child could be, you know, in California, and you have no idea, right? And you'd be stuck in this maze. I mean, a nightmare, literally disappearances of family members. You know, that fortunately is one of the few reforms that we've seen where now there is a system for being able to track family members who are in detention. Both their counsel and the family can look for them. But I mean, until recently, you could actually just have people vanish into thin air and not be able to know where in the country they would be. I mean, terrifying, right? Talk about due process, right?
Some of you may know about the case recently of the deportation of Yaneli, who suffers from depression, and she was detained in Ohio. There was a huge social media campaign around "Don't deport Yaneli." Even Yaneli was for periods lost, like they couldn't find her. She had been moved here, and then they were told this, and it's just like, this is a public case that people are watching, and still, they're getting lost. So if you're un sin nombre, if you're just a person, yeah. So I question the, you know, you can find it. I don't trust it.
I have one more question that I want to ask and then open it up to the audience for your questions. Last year, the Obama administration announced the policy of prosecutorial discretion to prioritize deportation cases where they would focus on people with serious criminal records and not focus on people who had broken the law by being in the country illegally and had no other criminal record. I wonder if being a parent figures into the formula or the regime that the government is using in making its prosecutorial discretion decisions. Do you know if it is?
It is, yes. It's one of the factors. There's a list of factors, and the ICE issued some memos in the last year that sort of lay out specifically what the primary factors that they are concerned about, and having U.S. citizen children is one of them. And in fact, I think slightly ironically, having either being a nursing mother or being married to a nursing mother or being a partner to a nursing mother is also a factor. And I laugh about that only because of the horrible things that happened a couple years ago when there were these massive workplace raids, and they were arresting people kind of whole scale, leaving kids without parents to pick them up at school. And in fact, mothers who were nursing were locked up in detention, and were not giving, they weren't able to pump, they weren't able to nurse. And that became very scandalous. So now they've included that in the prosecutorial discretion memos as well. But it is a factor. I think, I have personally very mixed feelings about how that's playing out. It's a good thing. It is a good thing that ICE is looking at each case individually, because for the most part, they don't generally do that. So if you're lucky enough to have a lawyer who can help kind of point out some of the really compelling factors in your case, you may be granted prosecutorial discretion, which doesn't give you legal status at all. So it closes your case in the immigration court and kind of puts you back into a likely undocumented status. It could work for some people. I think what's dangerous about it is this focus on ICE saying it's going to use its resources to quote unquote go after the dangerous criminals, because as we sort of hinted at, those quote unquote dangerous criminals are people who are our friends and our family members and our neighbors who may have had some kind of bad act in their past, but we can't look at them as individuals anymore because of what I was saying earlier. So those people are just sort of caught up in this system, and the prosecutorial discretion memo is sort of, getting rid of all those people while, sort of setting us up to only like the quote unquote good immigrant. And it's a challenge, but I will say that I have seen quite a few cases benefit from it in a very good way. We've seen, in some cases, ICE is actually approaching attorneys and saying, this case looks like a good case for discretion. We want to talk to you about it. And at different levels, so people who have deportation orders, people who are appealing, they're happening. And, it's a positive thing in that, it's a little bit of give for people who are caught up in the system. But where it breaks down for me is that you have to put your faith in ICE to make a determination to have discretion. And what we need is to have the supposedly neutral arbiter of the immigration judge to have that discretion. But the laws are not structured that way, so the judge has no discretion. And we have to turn over all of that discretion and put reams of paper about our clients in front of an immigration officer or in front of a lawyer who works for ICE to kind of beg them to not deport our client, right, or to not deport that individual, and that's not right.
And can I just situate again what prosecutorial discretion is in the context of immigration policy more broadly? So the last time we had a massive immigration reform in this country, a massive legalization program, was 1986 under President Reagan, IRCA. And in that process, people who were there before a certain date could actually adjust their status. What IRCA didn't do was actually open sufficient channels for immigrants who wanted to come here to arrive here legally. So 25 plus years later, after IRCA passes, we have 11 million undocumented people in the country. That's that's actually the first problem. The second problem is mandatory detention. But they're both big problems. But when people say, well, why don't they just get into the back of the line? First of all, there is no line, for most of these people, right? And so we need to fix our broken immigration system. And so but Congress for the last 10 years has been incapable of passing immigration reform. So what we've said to President Obama is, okay, Congress is broken, we acknowledge this, but you have the power to do something. So we actually started a pen campaign last year where we said, just like under the Civil Rights Act, there was issues saying, I don't want to sign it, so they actually did a whole thing of sending him pens. We sent Obama, thousands of pens saying, just sign an executive order that says, I'm not going to deport these people. You have the power as president. What we got instead of an executive order was prosecutorial discretion memos, which are not laws. They are discretionary. They are guidelines. They are suggestions. They don't actually say, don't deport a student who would be eligible for the DREAM Act, who has been here since he or she was 2 years old, doesn't even speak the language in their whole country. It says just consider not deporting them, right? And that's only for people who are in deportation proceedings. So prosecutorial discretion only affects 300,000 people who are in deportation hearings. So what we were getting people calling us during the summer saying, oh my gosh, I heard President Obama said if you're a dreamer, if you're in a same-sex marriage, if you're have a relationship with someone in the military, that you're going to get, that they'll say they won't deport you. And we said, we'd have to tell them, no, that's only if you're already in deportation proceedings. So we had some people trying to get deported so that they could be eligible for prosecutorial discretion. So I'm not saying it's not a good thing for some people,
Right.
But the larger problem is we need to fix the broken immigration system by passing immigration reform, at the very least DREAM legislation, and we need to end mandatory detention, because those are the two issues. These memos are really just very crude Band-Aids.
Okay, time for your questions. We have two new school students, friendly, wonderful people with microphones in their hands. So raise your hand if you have a question. Right here, yes.
Hey, so I guess one of the most shocking facts is that in the past 15 years, you said the system has grown 4 times, quadrupled. I was wondering who the economic players behind that are, because usually it's like economics that drive people to continue something that spends so much money and takes so much effort, when it's really no harm to a society to have people working undocumented.
So I know I've talked too much time, but I really wanted to talk about the money piece. Can I just quickly say? So I think there's a direct correlation between the money and and the growth. We spend $2 billion a year on immigration detention. That's $5.5 million a day. That's $4,000 a minute on immigration detention. Why is this happening? Well, one part of the story is the growth of outsourcing detention facilities to private prison contractors. There are 3 big private prison contractors in the United States that contract to provide detention facilities. One is the Corrections Corporation of America, another one is Geo Group, another one is the Management and Training Corporation. And what we're seeing is, first of all, there's been huge amounts of research done looking at the amount of lobbying resources that these corporations have invested in order to get prison beds. Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, was one of the biggest lobbyists behind the Arizona bill. They came quite close to actually drafting the Arizona bill. They were so intimately involved with passing it. And why did they want to pass the Arizona bill? Because the Arizona bill meant more beds and more money for them. And what we also see is corrections corporate. First of all, in some cases, these privately run facilities actually aren't even cheaper than the public facilities. But when they do cut costs, where do they cut costs? In the wages of the workers. And what that means is they have higher turnover. That means that the workers are more disgruntled, and that leads to unsafe facilities, right? And in more chaotic situations for immigrants who are detained by correctional officers who aren't being paid a fair wage. So this is really a big part of it. The privatization of the detention system and of the general prison population is a big part of the story.
And it's also, just to add one little piece, it's not only the private prisons, because county jails are using contracts with immigration to sell as a windfall, right? I mean, they're convincing their local voters that this is something they want to have. We just had this experience in Essex County where the Essex County Sheriff, where they just expanded the detention contract hugely, said all over the press, this is a way to make money for the Essex County residents, and in fact might help us reduce property taxes, right? Which probably wasn't even true, but they're selling this as a way to bring money into the suffering coffers of county governments.
Or in the cases of Willacy, they're actually coming in and selling the town a bill of goods about why they should build these detention centers because they're going to provide jobs, but then they basically use money, taxpayer money, to kind of fund it. It's selling a bill of goods, basically.
Yeah.
And then they get sucked into this, and then you're stuck. And you have to, the only way to make money, as we've all said, is by keeping a body in the cell. That's what it becomes. You put a body in the cell in order to make money. And so the easiest body to put is an immigrant who doesn't have access to a lawyer, right? Won't complain. So is going to be there doesn't know, there's no time limit, because there's no kind of standards or regulations, so keep them, an extra week. It's extra money. It's ultimately money-making.
Another question over here. Yeah.
My name is Ruthie Epstein. I work at Human Rights First, focusing almost exclusively on the issue of immigration detention. So I want to, first of all, thank you for bringing together this fantastic group of panelists to talk about a really important issue, and as Maria says, is one that's not often covered in the media. I just wanted to make a comment about your public advocate question, the question about is it a good thing or not that ICE has appointed this public advocate, and because I think it provides a lot of, the response to that appointment provides a lot of insight into the larger political context, which is really upsetting. I tend to agree with Amy's skepticism about how much really to cheer this appointment. As she said, the person who was appointed has been with ICE serving in a similar capacity for many years. He's fairly accessible, but he also has, there's a limited amount that he can do. Additionally, he reports to the head of ERO, Enforcement Removal Operations, so he's really not an independent advocate in any sort of way. He's kind of an access point into the agency. So it was kind of like a softball thing for Director Morton, the head of ICE, to put out there. The response to this announcement a couple weeks ago was one, Lamar Smith, Republican congressman from Texas, basically framed this as, okay, the Obama administration has appointed an advocate for undocumented immigrants. This is yet another example of, Obama's soft on immigration policy, despite the fact that he's deported more individuals per year than any previous administration. So very, very false framing of what this appointment really means on the right. Number two, in the National Review Online, a guy named Mark Krikorian, who is the executive director of Center for Immigration Studies, wrote, which is a very kind of innocuously named organization that is affiliated with an organization that's been called a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center and is frequently called as a witness before Congress to provide the, quote, other side on immigration. So he has a very powerful voice. He also framed this very lightweight kind of appointment of the public advocate in the National Review, which is a major publication read, across both sides of the aisle, as another soft on immigration policy from the Obama administration. And that is where you could actually find the contact information for Andrew Lorenzen Strait, who's the public advocate. He printed his email and his phone number, and apparently directly after that, I actually sent a quick funny note to Andrew saying, oh, you're famous now. And he said, oh, that must be why I've gotten a flood of emails. So I think just to remember that even such a soft type of reform as this is immediately seized upon by the right in such a disingenuous and hateful way really reminds us what a difficult political context this is.
Great,
Can I
thank
just
you
tell
very
you,
much.
just briefly, because we did interview Mark for the documentary, and I don't think this cut ended in, but a much broader, so not minutia, but the broader perspective of someone like Mark Krikorian, who basically said, that period of time when the United States was an immigrant-friendly country, that was in our adolescence as a country. And we've grown up. So we shouldn't be that anymore. We're beyond that. And I just found that, I was like, wow, so you just kind of decided, So I guess we should pull back Statue of Liberty, just kind of wrap her up. But again, part of the problem is that we don't have, it's not out there. So then let's talk about that. Is that really what we want to say? It's done and over with.
Another question, right here.
Can you hear me? I would like to shift this a little bit, and I'm fascinated by the fact that no one from the government was willing to come and participate in this panel. I'm not interested in what the reasons were, but did you try to get an elected official? Did you try to get Jerry Nadler's representative or someone from Senator Schumer's office, someone to come and discuss where this might go? And then I like to push it a little bit further. Anybody who's watching statistics knows that the rising voter in the United States is the Latina, the Hispanic voter. And we also know that there may be a vice presidential candidate, a Cuban named Rubio, who may be on the Republican ticket. We know that very soon this issue is going to have to be part of the campaign. So my question is, why is there no one here that is supposed to deal with some of the eloquent complaints and descriptions we've heard up here? Somebody should be here to talk about that. So I'd like to hear the panel talk about, I guess, the political ramifications, and we are already in the middle of the 2012 campaign.
Well, I'll just respond to your question about our invitation. Yes, we did reach out to members of Congress and ICE and policy advocates who are more critical, or I should say more supportive of the immigration detention system than any of the panelists here, and we were not able to interest any of them in joining us. The political question, and Maria, at the end of your documentary, you discuss that, and you kind of look at what are the implications of this, not just the detention system, but the whole policy of detaining and deporting record numbers of people for the upcoming election. And maybe you could talk a bit about that.
You know, I think that when you come down to it, we are a democracy, right? We want to think of ourselves in that way, even though not a whole heck of a lot of us vote. But the thing is that you need to have engagement on this issue. And that's exactly that's where we all started, is that the lack of engagement. That's why the fact that you guys are here is so important, because there is a lack of engagement. And if you think about this in terms of the historical moment that we're living in, it is a moment when our country is asking for leadership. That's what we're asking for some kind of moral authority. I've said this in the past. I think, you know, yes, what is happening in these detention centers is a civil rights crisis. It is a human rights crisis as well. It is a human rights crisis. But I think that, you know, the cynical part of me thinks that in terms of looking at the Obama administration, that they won't move on this issue unless maybe an October surprise, maybe something very close, very limited, you know, possibly. Newt Gingrich was an interesting candidate, or could be, well, who knows, in terms of Newt Gingrich, just because of his position on immigration. But what you're looking at in terms of the Republican Party is basically that question, which is, are you looking at the numbers? Because if you're looking at the numbers and the statistics and the demographics, you really would want to be creating some kind of opening with the Republican Party when the Latino demographic is the only one that's growing. So I go back to that very simple analogy of your head in the sand. The problem is the consequence for all of us and for our democracy, which in terms of the Latino voter, this is the part where it gets really distressing, because there is so much anger around the inaction that will the Latino voter just say, you know what, I'm not even going, because I'm not going to, you know, I'm not getting an alternative from the Republican Party, and I'm angry with the Democratic Party, and I'm going to stay home. And if that happens, to me, it's not just this election that's affected. It's the fact that you have the children of those people who are deciding not to vote, who are then hearing their parents say, I'm not going to vote, and they're the next generation. They're going to be like, well, I'm not going to vote. And so I really am thinking about, what are we saying then to following generations about not voting, and therefore then we just get deeper and deeper into this hole, because what we need here is democratic engagement, civic engagement, the pushback, the real, small d democracy, the pushback.
Can I just add a little piece to that? I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've been frustrated for many years on the lack of policy change, and there are moments where I do feel inspired, and that is when I see people coming out and really thinking about what it means. And so I agree with Maria that you all being here is part of the change, because fundamentally I think what we need to do is change hearts and minds before we're ever going to change anything in Congress. And so that's our work locally. But I also think there's a wonderful professor who I think now is at University of Washington or Oregon named Daniel Tishnor, and he's just done some fascinating work on nativism and kind of why it's been so hard for us to change immigration policy in this country. And it's a fascinating discussion about we have these really deep feelings, like deep-held philosophies, beliefs about the way the world should be. And that plays into our perceptions on immigration, like how many people should we let into this country, and what rights should they have when they're here? And should we be, providing social safety nets, or shouldn't we be providing social safety nets? And should the doors open, or should the doors close? And what does that mean? And he ties historical figures to this analysis. And it helps make sense of the fact that it is so hard because there's so many competing interests and fears, right? But also, just to say one more thing, and this is a kind of a shameless plug, on March 23rd, there's going to be a day-long conference on immigration detention at Rutgers Law School that's being coordinated by Rutgers, Cardozo, Seton Hall, and NYU Law. And Senator Menendez, who has been a leader in the Senate on immigration issues for many years and on detention issues in particular, will be the keynote. So if you want to hear an elected official who, is frustrated, I think, with how hard it's been for him as an elected official to really make any impact, I think it's going to be a really great conference, and if you want to see me after, I can give you more details about it.
And just two more sort of quick questions coming from the New York politics perspective around why there's not elected officials here. I have two slightly different perspectives. I mean, one is just quite simply, we're a blue state, right? And people don't feel like they have to get the immigrant vote. And the New York Immigration Coalition runs a Get Out the Vote campaign. And the idea is to say to Latinos and to other immigrant voters, you can't take our vote for granted. And we have to come out there in full force and say, you can't assume that you have our vote. And there are a lot of people who are saying, oh, we're going to stay home. So that's an important, piece. The other piece, which is even more local, is that the detention centers, for the most part, aren't in New York City, right? They're in New Jersey, right? There's a big federal detention center up in Buffalo, but most of the people who are being detained are being sent to Essex or Elizabeth. So actually there's not really, it's invisible here, and this is where Maria Hinojosa started. This is an invisible thing, so I would encourage anyone to make it more visible to people, is actually to go out and join the Sojourners Visitation Program and go out and visit immigrants who are in detention. They frequently don't have anyone visiting them, right? Part of the reason why they're not here, elected officials, is because the immigrants from New York are all in New Jersey. So we need to kind of go out there and see it and make it visible to the elected officials here and to the rest of our communities.
It is 8 o'clock, and I know that there are a number of questions still, and I hope that the conversation can continue with the panelists, and it's going to continue at Rutgers on, say the date again?
March 23rd. It's
March
Friday.
23rd.
It's all day.
We so appreciate you coming tonight, and thanks to the panelists. It was a terrific discussion. Thank you so much.